primary reason I'm up here is that my father is Pat Oliphant, who, in my opinion, is America's greatest living cartoonist.
Hold on.
And I've had the privilege to grow up around political cartooning my whole life. And my dad retired a couple of years ago. I actually called him a couple of days ago to talk to him about what is happening with Rob. And he sounded really sad and he sounded really angry. And he said, you know, this is what we're up against. And kind of a wistful tone around that. He was very sorry that due to eyesight he can't be in the game anymore. But I have to say, Rob Rogers is one of the very best political cartoonists in America.
Thank you.
We have been unbelievably lucky in Pittsburgh to have him, and he's extraordinary and was doing his job extraordinarily well when he was fired on President Trump's birthday.
That's true. It was his birthday.
Yeah.
A gift from the Block family.
So, how was your week?
What I love is there have been a couple of people who haven't heard anything and you know knew I was having some issues, and somebody emailed me like right after a few days after it happened and said, "Hey, what's going on? How are things going?" And they didn't know I had been fired, so they somehow missed the media storm. But no, it's going fine. I'm back to drawing again. There's been a lot of media interviews, which you know are very flattering, but I'm more comfortable behind the drawing table than behind the camera, or in front of the camera. It's actually going well. You know,
I was being sarcastic,
okay.
Actually, when I asked that question.
I knew you were.
But I'd let you go with that for a while. But
go into it.
So, you know, I'm struck by, and you and I talked about this as we talked about this session, that you know, the First Amendment issue here actually is on the side of the Block family. You know, it's their newspaper, they can do what they want. But what happened to you is part of what we've been talking about here today, a culture of silencing dissenting voices. And you know, I'm mindful of the fact that at one point in his career, my dad, who was notorious for being edgy and mean, was described
my
as
hero.
He was described as he would have been an assassin if he hadn't been a political cartoonist. And you get fired for being angry.
Yeah.
So what's that about?
Yeah, it does go. It is part of the job description, and I think that they couldn't think of any other reason. They couldn't say he got fired because we wanted him to draw, you know, these kinds of cartoons, and he was drawing those kind. He was doing his job. They couldn't really say that, so they had to come up with something, and so angry seemed to be the key word. But yeah, I mean, that is part of the editorial cartoonist's job, to be angry.
Well, and let's talk a little bit about what is the editorial cartoonist's job, because I think people have two models in their head, and they actually are the two models that exist. There is the model of, which you represented, of the highly independent, iconoclastic, kind of difficult cartoonist who expresses what he believes or she believes is the important message to put out into the world. And then the other model is you do the bidding of a publisher or you do the bidding of an editor, and really you're an illustrator for a concept.
Right.
When this was all going down with you, my sense was that they were trying to turn you from the independent cartoonist into the house cartoonist. Was that, in fact, what you were experiencing?
That's exactly it. You know, they would tell me what they thought was wrong with the cartoons. They would try to, you know, change them slightly. But mostly they would just say no, 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 without really an explanation. But then when I would do one that wasn't quite as pointed, because you know, every day isn't the same level of, you know, stomach acid. You know, you're kind of doing cartoons about different topics, and you kind of need to sort of ebb and flow with the news. So once in a while, I would do one, and they would say, you know, oh, that's funny, okay, and so, because they did print Trump cartoons, it's not like they didn't print any. But one example is I had two ideas killed, And I finally ended up with one. It was when Scooter Libby, he was pardoning Scooter Libby, and I did that one with the sign. I think, did they show it? Yeah. So it was kind of a complicated cartoon, but you know, they thought that was funny. And one of the things the editorial director said was, "Well, you wore me down," you know, after like 3 ideas, you know. So, but that was a pretty pointed cartoon. It wasn't as, you know, it wasn't as maybe vicious as some of the other ones. But so they were trying to mold me to say, these kinds of cartoons are okay, these kinds aren't. And also, they would try to limit the number of cartoons about the president, and that was kind of annoying because you couldn't really report on the news. You had to say, well, I've already had one in this week. I guess I have to wait until next week when that story's not even there anymore.
What was your sense of what the quota was for how many you could do?
You know, I got him to admit one time that 2 a week was okay, but he wasn't buying that because, you know, he said that in an email, and I said, okay, yeah, two a week, and then when I would do 2 a week, he would write back with things like, you know, get off Trump, or, you know, you're obsessing over Trump, and I'd be like, no, I'm not. I'm just doing my job.
Well, it was. It's interesting to when you think about that. They did run some, and and yet, what are you supposed to do as a cartoonist when the role of the cartoonist is to speak truth to power, and
right.
And the president dominates the news cycle every day. Did you point that out? That
I did many times, and I would get lectured on how variety is the spice of life. You know? And I'd be like, okay, well, that doesn't really, you know, cover today's news. I mean, it's almost like they wanted me to do the stories about, you know, the puppies or the, you know, the rainbows. I don't know, whatever else was going on in the news. You know, the funny thing was, it got so bad during that 3 months after Boris arrived that does everybody know the story?
He was the new editorial page.
Yeah, the new editorial page editor brought in from Toledo to oversee both editorial pages, because that's our sister paper. So during that 3 months, I would get to Brood on Grant Day, and I would be like, thank God, you know, I don't have to fight him today. You know, I don't have to, like, worry about, you know, I can just draw. And it felt so nice that I thought, you know, that's what was so hard, because it could have been very easy for me to just fall into that and just say, okay, I'm just going to draw, you know, non-threatening cartoons for the, you know, for the remainder of this, and just, you know, until I'm ready to retire. And you know, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't sleep at night, you know, so.
Well, good for you. I shared with you part of the exchange that I had with my dad about the in the early days of the new administration. Mm-hmm. And, you know, this is, it's been an odd transition for my father to go. He's been an artist his entire life, and it's really eyesight that prevented him from continuing his cartooning. And we talked about the change in the administration. I said, you must really be missing this. And he said, I've been waiting my whole life for this guy. and when I shared that story with you, you actually had a funny reaction. Was like, you laughed, and then you said, yeah, but maybe not. Because the experience that you had was that suddenly you weren't allowed to cartoon about him. Right. So I want to talk a little bit about what's different about cartooning now than has been the case. You know, let's take this beyond your present or former workplace and talk about about the craft and what's different in the zeitgeist. So you've cartooned about 4 presidents, right?
I think it's more like 6,
6.
Actually, yeah.
Sorry for the undercount.
Reagan.
Yeah.
You know, I started with Reagan in the 80s.
So let's go back and talk a little bit about what it was like to cartoon for each of those.
Okay.
Can,
sure.
Yeah.
Well,
start with your favorites.
I will say this, that my politics weren't fully formed when I got to the paper after graduate school, when I was hired by the press as an intern. You know, I had done a couple cartoons a week for the college papers that I had been at, the different colleges, and you know, it was never really on too much of a deadline. So for me, the first couple of years, I was really sort of finding myself. But so Reagan, Reagan made it kind of easy because he had, a great to caricature, with the hair and then he would, he would do things that seemed, sort of like a sleepy old guy would do, and we could make fun of that, like the joke about the Russians, where he would say, we'll begin bombing in 5 minutes, and so there were all kinds of things, and then of course Iran-Contra happened, and that was sort of, the one thing that was interesting to me was I just barely missed the Nixon bubble, right? Like when I was in college, Jimmy Carter was in office, so I had missed that chance to and your dad, of course, did some of the quintessential cartoons on that, and so I, for my whole career, I was sort of like, I was looking for my version of Watergate, to cover, and each time, like, Iran-Contra was, yeah, that might be it, and then Monica Gate, and then there was. W had all kinds of different things with the torture and the CIA, and so there were scandals, but none of them really quite lived up to it, and I always missed that. But now, exactly what your dad said. I've been waiting my whole life for this too, and now look what happened.
So,
but I don't know if I talked enough about the presidents, but
yeah. Well, let's go back. I'd love to know, for example, what it was like to cartoon about Clinton, and what it was like to cartoon about Obama, since they're more recent.
Well, Obama was tough because for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, as a cartoonist and a caricaturist, you have to be very careful, racial sensitivity, and you've got to be a little more careful than when I draw like doughy white guys, I feel like, okay, I'm drawing myself, so it's okay, I don't, or at least people in my family. So I don't need to worry as much about somebody getting angry at the way I've depicted them. But obviously, with minorities, you have to be sensitive, and there's a history of bad stereotypes in editorial cartooning. So he was tough. Plus, I love the guy. For most everything he did. There were a few things that I didn't agree with, like the bailout and some other things that I could kind of give him a dig for. But for the most part, I liked who he was and what he represented. So I didn't have as much reason to go after him. With Bubba, I mean, he was kind of a cartoonist dream, just because he was always having these affairs, and there was always some affair in the news that you could comment on, and so and that crosses party lines, when you're talking about having affairs, and it's not the worst thing, obviously. And I did cartoons about how the public. Right when he was being impeached, the public was sort of saying things like, "Well, I wonder if we can just impeach him from the waist down," because they liked the rest of it. They liked what he was doing in the country, and that was a cartoon I did actually, and I think that was kind of what was great about him, was that he, and when he would jog and then stop at McDonald's, and I would have him with a Big Mac and stuff. So there was all kinds of little funny things that lent themselves to cartooning with Clinton. But with Obama, it was a little tougher, just because there wasn't as much there. I could go after the Republicans and how they were characterizing him, and that seemed to be a better foil for me.
Was there any, outside of the paper, or aside from the paper, was there any kind of shift in how cartoons about the presidents were received as you moved from Clinton to Obama to Trump?
Well, I will say that I'm not sure exactly what you're saying about how cartoons were received, but I will say that the one thing that's interesting to me right now in this sort of time we're living in is that, one of the things that happened when I was talking to them about my Trump cartoons, I said, well, if you're not happy, you could move me to the op-ed page, and you could put a conservative cartoonist on there, and so he asked me for some names, and I gave him some names. But when I looked at all their work online, I thought, oh my God, everybody hates Trump. It's not just the liberals that are drawing him like this. So
let me give you a list.
Yeah, this is an anomaly. This editorial page that we have right now in Pittsburgh. But yeah, I think that people were worried about drawing Obama and how they would depict him, and I think that was definitely a thing. Clinton, nobody really, worried about drawing him, but he was good to caricature. He had sort of that, that sort of, as I said, doughy white boy face, with the jowls and the round sort of reddish nose, like W.C. Fields or something, and then that gray swath of hair, So he was good. He was good to draw.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the process so that people understand how cartoonists work. My memory is deeply scarred about this. But, my memory is that you wake up in the morning, you're terribly cranky, you're avoided for a long time. Right. So
Yeah.
what is you get up in the morning, and what would the typical process be working with?
You just described it. No, it is sort of like that. The first thing once the idea is settled on, there's a calm, because the drawing part is fairly. It's not elementary. It's not that easy. But I've drawn my whole life, so the idea part is usually the more difficult part. So I would get up, have some coffee, start reading the papers, maybe turn on. Nowadays I turn on cable news and look at the internet to see what people are tweeting about from the New York Times or wherever, and then I make a list of topics in my sketchbook, and I will kind of mull over them, see which one makes me the angriest, as since I am angry. But see which one really is speaking to me, because a lot of times it's about timing. You want to hit a story before it disappears, and especially with the Trump White House, that could be minutes. So you want to address something that's going to be important. You also, the other thing that I think about is, if I come up with something on a topic, I want to get it out there, because I know there are dozens of really great cartoonists out there working, and I don't want to be the one that misses that. And I want to get there first. So basically, I'll kind of try to get my idea by lunchtime. And if I get my idea by lunchtime, then I feel like I've got time. If it goes much beyond that, if I'm like into the 2 or 3 o'clock hour, then I start to panic.
And what's the editing process like?
So in the beginning, like I said, when I first got the job, I would show the editor sketches. He sort of, this was Angus McCarran at the Pittsburgh Press, he sort of insisted on that. And that worked, because I got to be a better cartoonist, and I got to be a better editor myself of my own ideas. So then, after 2 years of that, he said, you're there, just go do your thing. And so I would just draw. And then when I got hired by the Post-Gazette in '93, they said, yeah, just keep doing this. We don't need to see anything. And so for 2 decades, I never showed anybody an idea. I never submitted an idea. I would just start to work on them. And then at the end of the day, they might say, oh, change this word or that word, or, to make it clearer.
How often did you have a cartoon pulled?
But then they might also say, no, we're not going to run it. And it would be 2 or 3 times a year. And they were always sort of these controversial issues. Yeah, really. Well, the funny thing is, even 2 or 3 a year, I felt, how could you,
Right.
But so you can imagine what the last 3 months have been like for me. How could you? How could you? How could you? How could you? But then, yeah. So now, then in the last 5, or maybe a few more than that, but I can't remember exactly when it started. My editor said, well, would you mind just submitting? I work at home because, I used to work in the office, but it just became easier to work at home, and they were very willing to let me do that. So I have a home studio, and so I'll email the idea in the morning, because my editor said, well, it might help us to know what you're doing. That way we can predict how the publisher might react, so we can prepare for it. And then also, if we have an editorial that day that is sort of on the same lines, we can either highlight it or take it off and use another one. So I would send the idea in the morning, and the editor would write back and say, great, or hey, how about, maybe change that word or this word. So it would just be me emailing the idea. I would write it out. And that happened, that's been happening for the last like I said, 5 or so years. And then when Burris came along, then that process became more difficult. But I was still doing that. And that's where I would get these responses from him, you know. But then I would, you know, sometimes I would send the email and just start drawing, you know, because that's, you know, sometimes they would be in a meeting or something and they wouldn't get right back to me. So, but usually I never, you know, up until that point, I really hadn't had that much trouble. So,
and the more this happened, how did you react? What was your instinct as a cartoonist?
My instinct was to get angry and to kind of yell at them. But I would always be very professional, and I would write back and I would say, you know, I would explain, have a long explanation of why this was an important topic. It was an important issue, and the way I was handling it, I thought was within the realms of editorial cartooning. I wasn't, you know, doing anything over the top. And then oftentimes I wouldn't get a response back, but it did make me more determined. Each time that something was killed, I would say, okay, well then I'm going to come up with another one, and I would do another one, and you know, and eventually that's why some of these got killed, because I would just say, I'm drawing this one, I'm just going to do it, and so you know it was difficult. I mean, because one of the things you don't want to have happen is when you wake up in the morning, you want that slate to be clean. You want to be able to say anything is possible. I want to be able to draw anything that I could even think of. Now, I know what the limits are in terms of like a family newspaper and, you know, what I can get away with, and I'm certainly not going to draw like Trump pooping on the Constitution, you know, or even though that would be something I would want to draw, but but you know, I know that's not going to get published. So and in fact, I think your father, didn't he, his only Trump cartoon, right? Wasn't it him
he had two that he
pissing on somebody, right?
Yeah,
or,
yeah, exactly.
I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was, when I saw that, I was like, that's what it's like not to have an editor. I love it, you know. So maybe you'll see one of those from me soon. But anyway, you don't want as an artist, you don't want somebody to put restrictions on you from the moment you wake up, you know, because you want to let your mind go. Part of the creative process is to be able to kind of just, you know, let your mind wander and go anywhere it needs to go to get to that idea. And I think that that when you start feeling the pressure that, oh, it's going to be killed, it's going to be killed, it's going to be killed, then that sort of takes the fun out of it, you know.
So I think this was obviously a foolish decision on their part from the standpoint of your being a Pittsburgh institution, incredibly popular. I've never seen outrage over somebody being fired like we've seen since the news was announced about you. But, you know, if we look at it from the Post-Gazette standpoint, it's their paper. And they have a right to set the editorial policy however they want. Cartoonists are notoriously, and you just proved it, are the bad boys and girls of journalism.
Right.
And maybe they didn't want that. So they made a decision to go another way. What's wrong with that?
I think it's more how they did it. So what they were trying to do was to force me to do something that I wasn't comfortable or willing or morally, acceptable to me to do. And I think it would have been more honest if they had just come in and said, listen, your cartoons, if you're not willing to draw these crazy right-wing cartoons that we want you to draw, or even just go softer on Trump, let's figure out a way for you to move on, and that, rather than making me think that all they were going to do is just sort of maybe say, hey, just temper those Trump cartoons a little bit. So I think that they just weren't honest with what they were telling me to do, and I was very honest with them. I said, listen, I have to draw Trump. I'm not going to change the way I approach cartooning. And when Burris actually said to me, when I first met him, he said, the publisher believes that the cartoonist's opinion should reflect the opinion of the newspaper. And I said, well, that's news to me, because every other editor I've ever worked for has said, you do your own thing. Now, they usually hire somebody that reflects their opinion, and that's why, as I said, if they wanted a different cartoonist, they should hire a different cartoonist, but don't force me to be that cartoonist.
What do you think is the impact for other journalists and for other both at the paper and for other cartoonists in the profession. I'm looking at Tony over there, who had a very brave column in the paper today.
Except he just won't keep that pact that we made. I mean, that was a blood pact, man. I mean, where are you, buddy? Come on.
Well, so how did it feel when you saw the ad by the Guild saying, "Hey, this is terrible, but there's still a paper and there's still reporting that's happening"? You're the guy now on the outside looking at that.
Yeah.
I'd just be curious to know how it feels, and then I'd like you to move to what does it mean for the effect on the profession?
Right. Well, as far as the ad goes, I mean, I think that was kind of a smart move on their part. But I will say this: a friend of mine who has lost more than one cartooning job, and he's still at another paper. So I don't know how he does it, but he said to me, the worst thing that's going to happen to you is you're going to wake up the morning after they fire you, and you're going to see the paper has been published, and you're going to go, "How could they do that? How could they do that?" So yeah,
we've all had some version of that experience, by the way.
So there was a little bit of that when I saw the ad. I was like, they're moving on without me, But as far as how it affects the field, I think that it's scary what this means. Just in terms of, first of all, I think I am emblematic. I'm a symptom of what's going on at the paper, and I don't think I'm the only one that's going to be affected. I think that it's going to hit the news side. I think they're going to creep into there, and they're going to be more people that are going to end up, on the street. But I also think the product is just going to suffer greatly, and I think that if you look at it broadly across the country, I think that the frightening thing is that Trump is attacking the media, is calling us all fake news. And some of his followers, maybe most of his his base are buying into that. So we're losing credibility that way, which is unfair. And then the news industry is already in trouble. I mean, especially newspapers. I mean, we've been economically hurting for a long time. So this doesn't help. And I think when you start to get rid of people that are the people that make a newspaper, and I'm not saying I was the only thing at the newspaper. I think there are a lot of talented people still there. But when you start taking, the people that are offering something different and something new and an independent voice, then I think you're going to hurt the newspaper in the end. And so I don't know. And cartooning in general, I think that there will always be a place for it. Satire is needed more now than ever. And I think that there will always be a place for it online and on TV and other places. So I'm optimistic that there'll be people like myself still fighting the good fight and drawing cartoons about the president. But it is sad when when a newspaper that you've given your life to for 25 years, suddenly says, sorry.
You weren't here for this, but Yasha Monk, who spoke to us earlier, talked about steps on the road to autocracy, and one of the steps that he listed was the moment where news organizations become owned by friends of the would-be strongman,
right,
and begin to silence voices critical to the regime. Mm-hmm. And I'm just curious, was there ever a moment in this where it felt not like a difference of opinion, but like you were being silenced?
Oh, absolutely. I think that the hardest thing is to spend hours coming up with an idea, throwing away all the bad ideas, and coming up with something that you think is fresh and funny and really hits the point, and then have somebody say, somebody insults you and say that's a terrible idea, and it's or it's overworked, or it's whatever the insult is. It did feel like they were trying to silence it. It felt like they were trying to defeat my confidence, and push it down until I would just sort of acquiesce, and that's silencing my voice. If I'm even going to go anywhere near softening what I want to say, then they've won, and they've silenced my voice. So Yes, it did feel that way.
Do you hear from colleagues around the country as to whether that's common? Are you alone in that?
Whether it's common?
Yeah,
Oh, you mean
are colleagues of yours experiencing the same thing?
some of them have. I have heard from a couple people who have lost their jobs at papers, and you know, this was sort of public, so everybody could sort of hear what happened to me in the news stories. But yeah, I've had some colleagues say, yeah, that happened to me. They started killing, you know, cartoons, you know, every other day, and then they would let a few in, and that would, you know, make me feel like I was safe again, and then they would start killing them again until finally they would just push them out. You know, I guess, you know, it's happened before, and I think that in this case, it was just because of the public nature of Trump and the public nature of how they did it. I think my story is a little different, but I think it's it is a common story.
And, you know, to the cynic who looks at this and says, okay, it's unfortunate, but it's cartooning. And I've heard that line. What's your answer? Why does cartooning matter in the history of American journalism?
Well, all you have to do is look at other countries. You look at Turkey, you look at Syria. You know, Syria, there was that famous cartoonist who was beaten. His hands were broken, so he couldn't draw, you know. And in Turkey, there's a cartoonist in jail right now for doing political cartoons about the president. And I think that all you have to do is look at those countries and realize that could be us if you know, if it keeps going the way it's going. And so I think that's the reason. We have to keep you know, keep these leaders in check, and the newspaper was always the one to do that. And now it feels like, you know, they're failing in that. But I think cartoonists have to continue to carry that flag and fight that fight. But it could be much worse. Right now, we still have the freedom to do that in this country, but in other countries, they don't.
Some people have said that we're actually living in a golden age of satire because of the late night programs where comedians of all sorts are commenting on social issues.
Right.
Is the profession of cartooning shifting more to and being replaced by comedians and
yes, I think that is true. I mean, I think that's happened. That's been happening for decades, though. It's not really a new thing. I mean, when you looked at The Daily Show, you know, where people were actually going there to get their news, you know, and cartooning at one point in history, like when the Herblocks and you know, the Oliphants of the world were like syndicated to every newspaper. I mean, they were rock stars, you know, and these guys were in demand, and they would give speeches, and they would, you know, they would go all over the country, and I think that there was a time when everybody got their news from the newspaper, and they got their satire from the newspaper or a magazine, and that changed with the television age. And I think that, so yeah, we are a bit of a, you know, an old dinosaur in a sense, but that was why it was so surprising when we had this outpouring of support and everybody being interested in this story, because, you know, it's like, wow, you know, you guys know what an editorial cartoon is. I didn't. Who knew? You know, I thought you were all watching, you know, the Comedy Channel or something. But yeah, it is kind of surprising to see that there is still an audience there that remembers, you know, what the importance is.
I want to go back to a question I asked earlier and explore this a bit further, because I think we went in a different direction. I'm really trying to understand.
That's what my editor said too. Yeah.
I've been in that role too. It's you know, it feels to me as though the public's acceptance of satire is more loaded today than it was 20 or 30 years ago. And you know, I can remember my so death threats, for example, were always a thing, and I can remember my father getting them. I also remember the BS stamp, not abbreviated, that he used to keep on his desk, right. and he would stamp letters he'd get with that and send it back. And I don't know why we're all still alive. Frankly,
that's right.
But you would never think of doing that today. But did you encounter, or have you encountered a marked increase in hostility during certain presidencies? And how does this one compare to, say, cartooning under Obama or cartooning under Clinton?
Yeah, it's different because when somebody has to take the time to write a letter and they can't just comment on a blog or a post, you don't get as many death threats or angry letters. By the way, just to backtrack a little, Angus McCarran, the editor who hired me, had that bullshit stamp, and he used to he used to stamp some of my sketches with it, you know. and then that's when I knew he really was in a bad mood. But back to the story. I mean, I think that now it's so easy for people to not even be held responsible for what they say or do. They can just go on and make all these comments, and they usually are pretty negative. And so I think it's much easier for them to do that and be vitriolic and say whatever they want. But yeah, so I think that's changed. I would say that it's sort of been even up until Obama, and then Obama, it got bad. You know, people just felt entitled to sort of say racist things, and you know, and it was pretty ugly. What's interesting is it depends on the venue, right? So, for some reason, on the Post-Gazette website, you know, my blog on the Post-Gazette wasn't really high traffic, you know, because it was a bad software. So, but anyway, but there were enough people that were left over from the old software, and they would go on there, and there was about 10 people, like 3 liberals and like 6 conservatives, and they would just get into these long fights. I would never get involved but they would say the nastiest things, you know. And so it's interesting how it can change from venue to venue. Facebook, you know, most of those people are followers because they like my cartoons, so there's not as much venom there, but occasionally you get that. But like, for instance, all these stories that have been written, one of them was written for Fox News online, right, about my firing. And, you know, most of the other stories, like the New York Times and the Washington Post, they were all like, oh, you know, this is terrible, what's happening to our world? And then on Fox News, it was like, damn right he should have been fired, you know. and then they would call me all kinds of names and, like, you know, really nasty stuff, and says, you know, the guy should go out and die, you know. And I mean, that was
a news piece.
And that was a news piece, yeah. Right, that was just the news piece, and then the comments were even worse. Yeah. No, they actually did a very even-handed story. I mean, it was pretty straightforward. The funny thing is, they you know, it was Fox News here, but they got the story from The Guardian. You know, The Guardian had interviewed me, and so they decided to take off from The Guardian. I guess they didn't want to use the New York Times or the Washington Post. So, but yeah, the comments were horrific. I mean, they were just terrible.
Speaking of which, you did an extraordinary cartoon today. I just want to say it was, I don't know if you all saw it, but do you want to describe it for us quickly?
Sure. So I did one on Antoine Rose today, and I just published it online at about 1:30, I think. So you may not have seen it yet, but it shows a policeman shooting the young black man in the back. It doesn't have any labels, but then the caption at the top is, meanwhile, far from the border, children are still being separated from their families. Yeah.
Let's talk, extraordinary cartoon, actually, and what I love about that, aside from the artistry of it, is the capacity to connect those two issues in such a profound way. And we like to imagine that what's happening at the border has nothing to do with us, and yet it's entirely us, and you just illustrated that.
Yeah.
That's the magic of cartooning, to be able to bring a complicated message home, which again is why you're one of the best, and should be recognized as such. But what was the reaction that you've gotten so far online to that?
It's been interesting because, there's been so much support for every time I put a cartoon up. I've put 2 others up since my firing, and the support was overwhelmingly good and great. And this one has gotten slightly mixed, because I think some people feel very strongly, and of course I do not hate police, even though I've done a few cartoons while I've been in Pittsburgh that have gotten me into trouble. But some people are saying, oh well, he got what he deserved, and I was just like, wow, that's a shock. So the comments today have been more diverse than usual.
And what's your policy? Do you ever react to any of those, or do you just?
No, my policy is to stay out of the fray and let them let some of the people defend me if they're Plus, I spend a lot of time working on these cartoons, and if I got involved in that, my day would be gone.
Right.
I wouldn't have time to do anything.
So the question you hate you shared with me before we came on was, but everybody wants to know,
No,
is
that's right.
what's next for you?
Yeah, and I don't hate it. I just said, like, that seems to be the most common question. So, but no, the great thing is, it is one of those things where I know instinctively what the next thing is, and the next thing is just more of what I've been doing. But then that's only a few days. That's only going to be probably about 3 days a week, and then I'll have time to do work on other projects. And so I've had a lot of interest from other newspapers and places to do freelance. And I was telling you, I've even gotten requests for freelance from people that are just, I'm sure their hearts are in the right place, but they're saying things like, "Oh, would you like to illustrate my cookbook?" Or I'm a singer and I have this album that I'm going to put out, and would you like to do the cover? Or do you want to collaborate on something? Oh, the best one, though, was this cannabis company said, "Would you like to do our branding for us?" And I was,
You might want to hop on that one.
I might want to think about that one. But no, there've been other legitimate news outlets that have asked if I wanted to do some work for them. So it's, right now I'm a bit buried in all of the email, but I'm gonna sort of take a step back and figure out what's next. But I do think it'll involve some freelance. It might involve a book, and whatever else comes along.
We have time for a couple of questions from the audience. So, yes.
Oh, okay. So, yeah. So when I'm coming up with the idea usually takes a couple of hours of reading and research and trying to figure out how the idea is going to happen. And then once I've crystallized it, I'll do a rough sketch, and then I'll start to ink it. So the idea usually a couple hours, then maybe 2 hours to get from sketch to ink, and then the color takes another hour to an hour and a half. So, and then in between there, I'm usually answering emails or doing interviews. But so it does take all day. I mean, there are days when I'm really pushing that 5 o'clock deadline, but I do try to sort of get it done and then have a life after that. So, but it can be all absorbing, yeah.
But they are really cranky the entire time. Tracy.
Yeah, just ask Sylvia. Can I say no comment? Well, some of them are friends of mine, so I don't like to to be overly critical of their work. But I would say that not all of them, but if most of them, if you look at them, you can kind of see what they were trying to get me to be.
This gentleman had his hand up.
I was just wondering if the process of political cartooning is informed by a lot of reading on your part. That's to say, current events, political, historical works. I've wondered about this for quite a while. So
I'm not sure I understand the question exactly.
a lot of reading. You personally, a lot of reading.
Yeah.
Does that find its way into your graphic?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, all of sometimes it's funny because the things that I grew up with or read as a kid or even things I've watched on television, it all makes its way in there somewhere. So yes, the reading does help a lot, and I try to I think you mean more than just the newspaper, right? You're talking about other things, yeah. Although sometimes I get away from politics when I'm trying to just read for fun. So yeah, so that doesn't always happen. But yeah, everything influences it. I mean, sometimes I hear a song and I think of something and I go, oh well, that might work as a metaphor, or something.
Yeah. Now, aren't you glad you didn't do that drawing of pooping on the Constitution?
That's right. Well, to confess, I have sketched it out. I could do that for you in about 5 minutes, but no. I think that there is a degree to which the partisanship of the nation right now, how divided we are, and how much we've retreated to our corners, has caused us not to be able to laugh as much. Yes, I would say that's probably true. I may be just observing it myself, but I do think that is true. But on the other hand, at the same time, we're in a place right now where I think people are looking for that release as well, because they don't know what else to, how else to sort of wrap their minds around what's happening. And so I think sometimes they go to the Daily Show, or they go to the newspaper cartoon, or they go to Saturday Night Live because they want to laugh about it, because otherwise they'd be curled up in a corner. So I think it could be both, really.
Yes, this gentleman.
Yeah, I have a question. Yesterday, a comment was made that some folks are considering ending your subscription to Post-Gazette.
Mm-hmm.
The word used was knee-jerk. I
Right.
disagree with that. Having been a subscriber for 25, 30 years at least,
Mm-hmm.
I'm disturbed over the last 2 years at least.
Yeah.
And been thinking about it for a long time, and I know there's some fellow writers here from the Post-Gazette.
Mm-hmm.
But your dismissal, is it not part of a larger issue with Post-Gazette that seems to be, I'm not simply talking about the positions on the president, but there are other candidates and other positions that have
Yeah, the Rick Saccone editorial. I mean, they killed my cartoon. That was the first cartoon that the new editor killed when I had a cartoon against Rick Saccone, because they were going to run the editorial, and they said no. And then I said, all right, well, we could hold it a day, so it's not opposite. It's not on the same page. And they said, no, we're never going to run that one. And I was just like, whoa. So. But you're right. I think it does affect more than just my job. I think and more than just the editorial page. I think it eventually is going to affect the whole paper. But I haven't really been weighing in as much on that one issue of subscription, non-subscription, because I feel like everybody has sort of their breaking point, and it has to be a very personal choice. And you have to weigh all the things. There are people that still work there that do good journalism, great journalism, and then yet you're giving money to these people that are terrible. And so you have to make your own personal decision. My personal decision was, they treated me pretty badly. I canceled my subscription, but and I don't think anybody would argue with that. And one other thing, I did talk to I did talk to the editor of the paper who was taking calls, and he said one guy was so angry, he called up and he said, I'm really angry because I should never have canceled my subscription over that racist editorial, because now I can't cancel it over the cartoonist. So that's something to think about. If you think there might be another one down the road, you might want to wait and cancel then. Wait till Tony is gone and then cancel. Well, one of the ways that I and I'm just doing an informal survey myself, but I would lay the Post-Gazette next to the New York Times and just see how the headlines both played the same story, even if it was the story from the New York Times in the, and they would soften the headline. I mean, it was never as tough as, or they would just take the whole story and put it inside. Yeah. There, people have been asking how they can help or how they can do something. So I have a new account with Patreon, which is a site where artists and musicians and people go and put up their work, and you can subscribe at different levels. It's kind of like public television, and and you can get something in your email if you do that. So it's just Patreon /Rob Rogers, and if you go to my one of my social media accounts, Facebook or Twitter, you can see it there. I've posted it there. So, but that's just a nice way to allow me, without a salary, to keep doing these cartoons until other things sort of come along. And people have been very generous. I mean, they immediately started signing up. So.
And has anybody bought the syndication rights for your cartoons in Pittsburgh?
Yes. There has been Charlie Deach and the Pittsburgh Current has, as you may have seen on social media, has been announcing over and over and over, we got the rights to Rob's syndicated cartoons. We're going to be running them. So yeah, they contacted my syndicate and they bought the cartoons through the syndicate. So they're going to be running them starting Monday, I think they said. So. I guess online and in the physical paper.
Great. By way of closing, I do want to acknowledge your partner Sylvia, who has been outstanding in I think supporting you and throughout this.
Oh, yes.
And also just thank you for the extraordinary work you've done. Dan said it already, but I think part of what makes the cartooning that you do so powerful is that we all get to experience it in a community context, and you become such an important part of the fabric of the community, even though you're talking about issues that are national and global, and then occasionally bringing them home to the local. So we're tremendously in your debt. We're going to miss that, but we hope it will reinvent itself in some new form, and that you'll be here. Thank you.
It should, yes. Yeah. And speaking of Sylvia, she's now the director of the art gallery at the University of Pittsburgh, a new job, and we are planning, her idea, to have an exhibit of the killed cartoons along with the other cartoons. Yeah. So that, I don't know where she is. She's somewhere here. She's up there. She can't see her. She's hiding. Anyway, she's great because she's now my editor at home, and she can be the one to insult me now. So, but she's doing great job there, and we'll have more information about that, on social media and other places. So.
Well, on behalf of a robust democratic dialogue, thank you.
Thank you.